great to be here. I'd like to thank all of you for sitting in this afternoon, and I'd especially like to give thanks to the royal family for putting on this most intriguing conference. Now, I want to pick up on something that Hernando started on, and that is mapping. And I want to talk about mapping in the furthest place on the planet from where we sit today, and that's in the Amazon rainforest. And I want to talk about how we're partnering with indigenous peoples to do this. These people have different knowledge systems, they have different ways of knowing. And I want to talk about the marriage of ancient shamanic wisdom and 21st century technology, and why I think it holds answers to many of the questions that are being asked here today. Now, we all know of the rainforest as the greatest expression of life on Earth, and we also know that these forests are being destroyed at an incredible rate. As an ethnobotanist who's worked in these rainforests for close to 3 decades, I know that the wonder drugs of tomorrow are literally going up in smoke today. So it may seem kind of curious to work with indigenous peoples, to work with unlettered, primitive, pre-literate peoples to come up with answers to questions that we in the industrialized world at Harvard and Yale and Oxford and Cambridge and all the great universities across the industrialized world cannot figure out. But here is why indigenous peoples are so extraordinarily important. If you look at this map, the green cross-hatched areas are national parks. National parks are somewhere between 5 and 8% of the Amazon. Well, I'm not prepared to write off 92% of the rainforest because I know the problems that will ensue. What I call your attention to here is the light green areas, which are the indigenous areas, which are 25% of the Amazon in Brazil, as you see here. And remember that there are 9 Amazonian countries, and countries like Suriname, that I'll be talking more about, north of Brazil, indigenous lands and semi-indigenous lands is 80% of the country. So, in summary, why partner with indigenous peoples to protect the rainforest? Number one, they control a lot of it, and the park guards are already in place. Number two, they protect vital headwaters, and I want to emphasize how important this is. And I don't think you can emphasize it too much being here in the great desert of the Arabian Peninsula. There's a lot of attention being paid to carbon trading. I think it's been oversold. First of all, because there is no panacea, there is no magic bullet, and this whole idea of putting a value on carbon and the rainforest is an interesting methodology which for the most part remains unproven. The value of water is unquestioned. Indigenous peoples, and this is true right here, as it is in the equatorial regions, have extensive ecological knowledge. Indigenous peoples in the rainforests of the world know far more about rainforest plants than do any educated botanist, ethnobotanist, physician, lawyer, what have you. And finally, it's the single best way to protect ecosystems around the world. Like I said, in the case of South American rainforest, the park guards are already in place when it comes to indigenous peoples. Americans like to get stuff done. We like to get stuff done in a hurry. We tend to be very culturally insensitive. But something you learn when you work with these peoples is it takes time. Another thing you learn with these people is the interconnectedness of all things. When I started in this business 30 years ago, people said to me, "Who cares about the rainforest? We need to worry about zero population growth." Now people say to me, "Who cares about the rainforest? We have to worry about climate change." Well, of course, overpopulation is what's cutting down the rainforest, and cutting down the rainforest is a major driver of climate change. So as I said, when you work with shamans, you learn about the interconnectedness of all things. I started working with the peoples of the Northeast Amazon in 1982, and 30 years later, I'm still at it. We hear a lot about capital at this conference, building capital, intellectual capital, but nobody that I've heard has yet mentioned spiritual capital. The malaise that afflicts many citizens of the industrialized world, stress, to put it very simply, I think it is a spiritual deficit that's caused by many things, one of which is destruction of the world's environment. And what is very, 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 very clear is that Western medicine cannot cure the ailments that afflict our society in terms of stress, and the things come from that. Thank you. As a shaman once said to me, "You know what kills white people? Worrying about worry." And here's why the story is the same right here. I encourage all of you to go home and read Wilfred Thesiger's Tales of Crossing the Empty Quarter, right here in the peninsula in the late 40s. He pointed out the Bedu could look at camel footprints, tell you how many camels had passed, how many were males, how many were females, which ones were pregnant, and what they'd been eating. So indigenous wisdom is not restricted to far-off corners of the world. It was right here as well. Here's the most important picture I'm going to show you. This is the Xingu Reserve in southeastern Brazil. Right here is the limit of the reserve. This is a road. This is the reserve on top. This is outside the reserve. 14 tribes of Indians, a bunch of white guys. Pristine rainforest, some scraggly-ass cows. There isn't even a single tree here. Carbon sequestered, carbon released in the atmosphere. It doesn't get any clearer than this. But here's how we've gone about fixing it, partnering with local peoples. Hernando talked about the importance of maps. Well, here is how indigenous peoples can seize control of their cultural and environmental destiny for their benefit, for the benefit of the world environment, and ultimately for the benefit of all of us here. When these people asked us to map their lands, we said we would not do it. And when they said, "You mean you won't help us?" we said, "No, we didn't say we won't help you. We're going to teach you to make the map." So it's an exercise in entrepreneurship and teaching self-reliance, because ultimately that's how you impart skills that can last a lifetime, if not longer. And just to show you why indigenous peoples around the world are so important, just using Suriname, the country of Dutch Guiana, north of Brazil, as an example. The first and most important river in Suriname, in the western Suriname, which forms the border with Guyana, is the Corentine, which you see outlined in blue here. Well, guess where this river comes out of? The indigenous forests of the Trio tribe. The most important river in central Suriname, this is the Kopanama. Guess where this comes out of? The Trio rainforest. The Suriname River itself, where does it come from? Maroon lands, another tribe. And then the eastern border comes from the Guiana rainforest. So protecting indigenous peoples, protecting these marginalized civilizations has very important externalities that benefit all of us. And just to wind up, before we get to the next speakers, let me show you the power of marrying this ancient indigenous wisdom to 21st century technology. We're looking at the country of Brazil. We want to zoom in and look at the state of Amapá in the northeastern Brazilian Amazon. We'll zone it. The largest rainforest park in the Amazon is the Tumucumaki Park, which you see here in the upper left-hand corner. And then next to that is the Tumucumaki Indigenous Reserve. Now this is 10 million acres, a 10 million acre indigenous reserve and a 10 million acre national park. When we started working there 8 years ago, there were politicians who said 4,000 Indians cannot possibly know a rainforest the size of Belgium, cannot possibly use the resources of a rainforest the size of Belgium, and the challenge was put to us to show how much they knew and how much they used. So we drew in the rivers and sat down with the elders of the 4 tribes and said, "Now do you have names for any of these rivers? Where are your sacred sites?" We made it into a map. Where do your medicinal plants come from? This is what we started out with. This is what we ended up with. 2,000 icons. Every piece of knowledge you see here was in the head of a pre-literate indigenous person living in the rainforest. So let's zoom down and show you how much these people actually know. We'll look at the lake on the left. If you hit this or any other icon on the map, it opens up. And an explanation comes out, in this case, in Apalai, which is the tribal language, and Portuguese, which is the national language. And so this is the type of alliance which I think holds the key for the future. It's not about pushing people off their land. It's not about forcing people to accept Western technology. It's not about making the mistake that capitalism and technology has all the answers, because that is patently untrue. It's finding a third way, like Tony Blair talks about. It's not the medicine man who holds the cure for all our ills, and it's certainly not the microchip. The sweet spot is somewhere in between. And what you see here are the next two speakers. On the left, Chief Almir Surui of the Western Amazon, and on the right, Rebecca Moore, the outreach coordinator for Google Earth. So it seems to me that the importance of a meeting like this is bringing people from different cultures, different regions, different religions together to come up with some common answers, to come up with some new answers, to challenge ourselves, to think outside the box, and find new ways of using these indigenous philosophies, this indigenous knowledge, and all the fruits of our industrialized civilization as well, and not using one to denigrate or destroy the other, because we do this at our peril. And just last night, I was in my hotel room and I received the results of a flyover in the Northwest Amazon. We're setting up some zoning for protection, an uncontacted tribe. So the last couple of days, we've heard a lot about climate change. We've heard a lot about poverty. We've heard a lot about disasters like Katrina in my hometown in New Orleans. President Clinton talked movingly about that today. But there are still magical places in the world. There are still people who remain untouched and indeed unsullied by the civilization that's come to dominate our planet, both for the good and for the bad. So let's take the best of these different worlds and marry it together in an entirely new way, because that's the best hope we have for going into a future which is as bright and dazzling and rich and diverse as the world into which we were all born. Thank you very much.